this is work I've been doing for the military here in the US, which is based on the work I have been doing for more philosophical audiences relating to John Searle's ideas in social ontology, but also to other sorts of approaches to social ontology, which I believe improve certain weak points in the Searlean approach. So the first main idea, which I'm going to be largely presupposing in what follows, is that we need to have not only speech acts in our field of view, but also document acts. And document acts would be things like signing a document or ratifying a treaty or reading a plan and executing it and so forth. And the longer term perspective here is that we will also be dealing with the ways in which information systems allow us to perform what we might call e-document acts. And I assume that in Belgium you have something like TurboTax, which is a piece of software which allows you to fill in your tax forms on your computer.
Yes.
That would be an example of an e-document act. And the military increasingly is being run not just on the basis of speech acts and document acts, but ever more on the basis of e-document acts, such as targeting a drone so that it would kill somebody. So document acts are becoming very important. And military planning is the background of what I'm going to be saying here, but I think what I say has quite general relevance to the understanding of speech acts and document acts of many sorts, not just planning related. Now, in the work that we're doing, both for the military and also for people who are working on the ontology of scientific experimentation, which is another side effort relating to this, we distinguish between plan specifications, which are the documents which are created through the planning process, and plan executions, which are the actions performed in realizing the plans specified in the plan specification. And very often I will use the word plan, but I mean typically the plan specification. Just occasionally, I will mean the plan in somebody's head, which they are determined to realize, which they have committed themselves to realize, because they have interiorized the plan specification. Now, the plans that we're going to be talking about are variously plans for the actions of a single individual, plans for the actions of teams, and plans for the actions of teams of teams. That will become clear as we go along. I am not going to be talking about human-machine systems, but as I say, the ultimate goal of all of this is to assist the understanding and the use of information systems as aids to human action, for instance, in a military kind of situation. And I will talk about the way in which teams of teams, which, for instance, entire armies, are commanded through commanders in a hierarchical cascade, which begins at a very strategic level or operational level and ends at the tactical level, where individual warfighters are being issued with commands to perform certain actions. And all being well, I will conclude with a comparison between commands in military operations and the commands which are involved in conducting an orchestra. So I will finish with music. Not necessarily musical music, but all right. Now, I think that you all know that I work on ontology, and that one primary goal of ontology, as I understand it, is to assist communication. And so when I talk about information systems in the military, they are increasingly facing the problem that different information systems built by different parts of the military do not support communication between the information systems built by other parts of the military. And when you're dealing with such communication problems between human beings, usually the human beings can negotiate their way through so that they come to an understanding. And I understand that even people who speak Belgian can understand people who speak English. But with computers, there are very often quite serious difficulties of bringing about effective communication. And ontologies are increasingly being viewed as a strategy for overcoming such communication difficulties. And the world's most successful ontology to date is the ontology which underlies the Siri app in your iPhone, which is an ontology of things like restaurants and movies and weather and so forth, which is what enables Siri to understand you when you communicate your desires, and what enables Siri to understand other people when they communicate their desires. All the communications are formulated in terms of a single common suite of ontologies. So this is another view. The ontologies in turn are used to tag data provided by airlines or restaurant guides or reservation systems. So what the ontologies do is they unify incredibly diverse, heterogeneous information systems so that they can become communicable with by human beings in a consistent way. So ontologies, in the simplest possible sense, are systems for tagging heterogeneous data. And an example of an ontology is the emotion ontology, which includes terms to be used for tagging data about emotions, data about people's behavior, data about people's physiology in connection with emotions. And the idea is that if you have the emotion ontology, then you can unify or gain unified access to a very large number of different kinds of information about emotions, and thereby do more effective research pertaining to emotions. The emotion ontology is also being used by various military intelligence projects because it provides a way of unifying data that we have about the emotions of people who are engaged in various different sorts of military relevant activity. Now, when you have a military operation, for instance, in Afghanistan, then you have very many groups of people involved, and those groups of people will typically have information systems. So they'll have databases, they'll have information systems which drive their logistics or their healthcare or civil affairs, the interaction between the military and the civilian population. The intelligence community will have its information systems, the targeting community will have its information systems, and so on. And the result is that there are very often problems of miscommunication. And again, ontology is designed as a vehicle to create more effective communication between not just humans, but also the humans who are working with these information systems. Now, I am still officially a philosopher. I don't really do very much work with philosophers anymore, but I still view what I am doing with the ontologies as being rooted in a certain approach to ontology, which is recognizably philosophical. So the problem with ontology is that its goal is to enhance communication, but ontology has become so attractive to people who face communication problems that everyone is now trying to build their own ontology. And there are software tools which will allow you to build your own ontology almost without adult supervision. And the result is that the ontologies do not serve to enhance communication, rather they serve to undermine communication by creating new ontology-based communication silos. What we need, therefore, is a strategy for ensuring that when people build ontologies, they do so in a consistent way. And for that, we need to establish what are the principles for ontology design that will bring about an effective and consistent set of ontology. And I and my collaborators have established such principles. So over a period of several years, we have established and tested and disseminated these principles, and they are now about to appear in a kind of guidebook to building ontologies, which is based upon an ontology, an upper level ontology called BFO. And now BFO is an upper level ontology. That means it is not specific to any domain. It contains very, very general terms such as process or object. It doesn't contain terms like human or speech or social organization. And so what we have been doing over time is gradually extend BFO in such a way that it would be the starting point for larger ontologies, which are built consistently in terms of BFO, but which extend BFO into domain-specific areas, including the area of speech act theory. Now, as some of you will know, I am very fond of the ideas of a German philosopher of law, also a follower of Edmund Husserl, who in 1913 created a study called the A priori foundations of the civil law, which is a study of the ontology of the promise, including the ontology of contracts, which are promises which involve some kind of document act, but also the ontology of social reality quite generally, insofar as social reality is founded on the use of language to do things like make a promise. Now, Reinach here based his ideas, which are ontological in something like the sense of Searle, on the German civil law. So he was a philosopher of law, he studied the law, and his theory of speech acts is very much based upon the sorts of speech acts that are involved in the law. But what I'm going to be focusing on is not the law, but another very similar artifact, which is military doctrine. Military doctrine is a very, very large and complicated set of documents which are ratified in something like the way that laws are ratified, through a quasi-political, quasi-legislative process. And the goal of military doctrine is to provide a common reference which will standardize the operations performed by warfighters when they are accomplishing any sort of military task, whether this be fighting, preparing to fight, retreating from fight, provisioning a fight. There is doctrine with regard to planning, doctrine with regard to commanding, doctrine with regard to anything which a military organization may need to engage in. And the reason for this is that when you plan a military engagement, a military operation, you need to use certain building blocks, Lego bricks, which you can rely on your subordinates to be able to realize consistently. You need to know what they can achieve. And these building blocks for planning are specified in doctrine and used in military training. So you train your army, or you train your military units by teaching them doctrine and by drilling them in the actions which doctrine dictates, so that you can rely on the fact that they have been drilled in a certain specific ways when you build your plan, and then the plan can be reliably executed, at least for the first few seconds of the actual military operation, because the actions that you build into your plan have been specified in doctrine and used in training. Now, of course, as soon as you do hit the ground and face the enemy, all kinds of things can go wrong. But you couldn't plan a military operation and you couldn't achieve anything militarily unless you had some kind of doctrine-based set of action building blocks. And these are action building blocks both at the level of the individual and at the level of entire armies and everything between. This is the joint doctrine hierarchy. So there is joint doctrine, but then there is also Army doctrine, Navy doctrine, Air Force doctrine, Marines doctrine, Coast Guard doctrine, and so on. There is joint doctrine, which means the doctrine that all of these different services all adhere to. And this joint doctrine is also recognized by NATO. So I presume that Belgian military doctrine is consistent with, if not very similar to, at least in its upper levels, joint doctrine. Now you can see that this is arranged as a hierarchy. There are very general doctrinal publications near the top. So there is the capstone publication, which is joint doctrine, and then there is the joint personnel doctrine, joint intelligence doctrine, joint operations doctrine. Lower down there is doctrine for legal support, doctrine for intelligence support to military operations, doctrine for countering air and missile threats, and so on. So the top level looks like this. And you'll see at the extreme left, there is a joint dictionary. And we are in fact working with the military now to create a BFO conformant formalization of the joint dictionary, which would be a joint doctrine ontology. Now, doctrine brings about the creation of something. In fact, doctrine itself is created. Doctrine is created through a process of formalization and ratification. Once doctrine exists and is put into practice, then it creates something else. Roughly speaking, it creates expertise on the part of warfighters. Now, the creating word here comes from Searle. So Searle, as I think everyone knows, I nearly said then in the room, but that wouldn't be quite right. Searle sees speech acts as enabling the creation of different kinds of entities. At least Searle sees the world in this way when he is talking ontologically. Sometimes when he sees problems in his work, he just stops talking ontologically for a few minutes. And then goes back to talking ontologically. When he is talking ontologically, he talks like this. So, for instance, he says in his book, Making the Social World, the language we use to describe these phenomena creates them. So phenomena such as claims and obligations. And that's because these phenomena are what they are, because they are represented as what they are. The representations are partly constitutive of institutional reality, the reality of governments, marriage, and so forth. So language doesn't just describe, it creates. And this is ontological talk, as I hope you all realize. So there are things like cocktail parties and marriages. I'm underlying this because in some passages, Searle would say that he's really just using this talk as being an aide-memoire, that there is no such thing as a marriage. It's really merely just a way of talking about physical particles or fields of force. But here I'm taking him seriously as an ontologist. All right, so that's the Searle thesis. Now, when we use a speech act to appoint somebody, then we change the world. But we do this clearly only if certain background conditions are satisfied. So we have to have the legitimate authority to appoint somebody for our speech act to be effective. Now, in the military, the legitimate authority is very well established in a very elaborate hierarchical organization. But the military is also interested in things like sincere intent on the part of the commander. In fact, one of the central terms in the Joint Dictionary is commander's intent. The army is also interested in things like valid formulation, and it's interested in acceptance by the addressees of a command, for instance. Now, it's important that John Searle's views give a very nice account of how these kinds of phenomena, marriages and so forth, come into existence. So when we perform a speech act, the world changes instantaneously. These two people are now married. So in other words, he gives an answer, a very good answer to the first question. How do marriages or roles or organizations or rules or prices or debts begin to exist? The question he does not answer very well is, how are such entities sustained in existence? So what, in virtue of what does a debt continue to exist when once I have promised you that I will pay you back when you give me €5 or drachma? Now, in answering this question, I have put forward a thesis according to which documents are a key element in what brings about the ability of the entities created by speech acts to endure in time. And you can see how this works. The reason why the marriage endures, in part, is the marriage license. It's still, the marriage license is still a linguistic entity. Well, you're not, all of you French speakers, I suppose, although you all speak French, I suppose. In the French translation of Searle's speech acts, as I understand it, the translation is used acte du langage. Now, that is a bad translation from my perspective, because acte du langage is already ambiguous as between speech acts and document acts. I am insisting that because of Searle's focus on speech acts, he ignores the crucial importance of document acts in explaining the power of endurance of the entities created by speech acts. But now, in order to effect this understanding, in order to see how documents provide one primary way in which claims and so forth are sustained in existence, we need to realize that there are other ways, some of which involve language, some of which do not involve language. This is a case where the document involves language. I guess this is a kind of way in which a document involves language, but it's a very new kind of language. I mean, it's not the kind of language that Searle was concerned by when he wrote speech acts. But this is a way in which a speech act created property of ownership or relation of ownership is made to endure by creating a document as a result of branding a cow. And there are other ways in which we ensure that entities in the social world are maintained in existence. I mentioned also marriage licenses, but also we do this by means of oaths, which are performed in public and which are associated with documents, and also with the knowledge of the people who hear the performance of the oaths in public, that the documents will be adhered to until death do the relevant person's part. So the survival of the marriage depends not just on the speech act of performing the oath. It depends on features of that speech act, which I tied together with the existence of documents and with expertise as to how documents should be used. Now, the military has solved this problem in a very systematic way. People are trained by the military to keep their promises. So they are turned into entities who have the right kind of expertise to use promises, both promises performed through speech acts and also promises performed through document acts, in their actions within the military. And the doctrine for this is formulated for the army in a specific army doctrine reference publication, Army Doctrine Reference Publication #1, which will be very important for what comes next. So this Army doctrine is maintained by the Training and Doctrine Command, or TRADOC. TRADOC has 3 jobs as it conceives itself. It designs the future army. It builds the army by finding the 1% who are willing to serve and using its talented drill sergeants to turn them into trusted professionals. And then it develops, that is to say, it maintains these trusted professionals into resilient leaders. Now, this is a way of, this is creating in the sense of Searle, but where the focus is not so much on the speech act, which creates the warfighter, but on the whole process of creating, building, developing a warfighter through the whole of his or her life. So this is ADRP1, the Army profession. So this gives you the idea. Making the ethical Army professional starts with speech acts. So Appendix B of ADRP1 is about oaths, creeds, and norms of conduct. It starts with a speech act. In fact, oaths are a very important feature in the life of military personnel through the whole course of their military lives. The speech act marks an explicit commitment to ethical behavior, but it's a public oath. So it's a part of common knowledge. I know that you've performed the oath. You know that I know that I performed the oath, and I know that you know that I know that I performed the oath. This is common knowledge, and there is a very nice statement of the importance of common knowledge in bringing about cultures, in bringing about coordination between human actions. In this book by Michael Suk-Young Choi, called Rational Ritual. I think this is a crucial element of understanding how social organizations work, because there is common knowledge of the people within the social organization, that all the other people are in the organization and have made the same commitments. So the Army professional begins to exist because of speech acts, but then he is maintained in existence, or she, through continued repeated cycles of training, evaluation, credentialing, assignment, more training, more evaluation, more credentialing, more assignments, and so on. So this is the lifetime of the Army professional. So the oath of service comes in, and then you have the private who wants to become an Army professional, and the private then serves, is observed, is evaluated, is trained, is educated, gets promoted, is trained again, gets new assignments, is evaluated again, and so on. This is the way philosophers should work. What we need is doctrine for philosophers. So the goal of all of this is to continuously re-engineer people so that when they act in a pre-coordinated way, in part because they are in part because they've been engineered to act together, but in part also because the plans have been built on the basis of a knowledge of what those people have been engineered to be able to achieve. So soldiers coordinate spontaneously when they're given commands because they've been trained to execute the actions which the commands specify. Now, this is a document act. When the commander stands up and speaks, he has his medals and his rank insignia and so forth visible. And that means that his speech bears its authority on its face. In much like the way in which the priest has a white collar which bears his authority on its face. And so the insignia map the structure of the organizational hierarchy. So the credentialing is based on evaluation, which is based on action, which is based on training. The credentialing occurs because the evaluation is positive, and so there is a promotion with a new insignia or insignium. So this is how we create teams and teams of teams with known sorts of expertise and commitments and loyalties and trust. And now there is something about information systems, but I'm not going to talk about that. What I am going to talk about is loyalty, trust, commitment, and plans. And now you will see how BFO works to provide a framework to understand all of this. So this is BFO. This is a fragment of the top of BFO. BFO has 34 different types, each of which has many instances. The most general type is entity. Entities are divided into two subtypes: continuant entities, such as people or tables or attributes of various sorts, such as your weight or your height, and occurrence, the most important kind of which is processes. Now, continuants are divided into two subtypes: independent continuants, which basically are continuants which have molecules as parts, such as people and planets and tennis balls, and dependent continuants, which are attributes of various sorts. The most important kind of dependent continuant for our purposes here is what is called a realizable entity. And this is defined as follows. A realizable entity is an attribute which is associated with some realization process. And the important thing is that realizable entities can exist even when they're not being realized. So examples are powers, tendencies, intentions, expertise, trust, skill, knowledge. All of these are realizables. You can have them even when you're asleep. You realize them by performing processes of certain sorts. So you realize the attribute, which is your expertise in using a keyboard, by typing on a keyboard in non-random ways. Now, another important type within the BFO ontology is roles. And roles are special kinds of realizable entities. These are the sorts of things which Searle is very focused on in his social ontology. Roles exist because they are, the entity which bears them is in some special context. So X, an X is a Y in context C because X counts as a Y in context C. That's Searle's use of the role idea. And the realization of a role occurs when the role is exercised. So a commander is a person with the commander role. A target is a location or a building or a person with a target role. Nothing is a target in and of itself. Something is a target only when it bears the target role because it's in some special social or institutional circumstance. And now another example of a realizable entity, which is important for our purposes here, is the disposition, which is something like a tendency or power. So the target, the target has as soon as the targeting list is formulated and the plan specification is communicated to the targeting unit, then the target has a disposition to be shot at. As soon as the plan as soon as the plan specification is committed to by the commander, then the commandees, the troops who the commander commands, have a disposition to realize the plan, and so on. All right, now let's do some Reinach. I'm going to give you an account of Reinach's theory of the structure of the promise. This is just a small fraction of his theory. I will apply it to commands. I won't apply it to all the various modifications which can occur when we deal with, for instance, plans which are misheard or plans which are not authorized and so on. I'll just talk about the case where we have successful or felicitous promising. So a promisor is an independent continuant in Buffo terms. The promise is a process, and the promisee is the person to whom the promise is made. And there are relations of one-sided dependence here, which are marked by the links between the promisor, which is independent, and the promise, which is a dependent entity. The dependent entity, which is the promise, has an internal structure. There must be an act of speaking, there must be an act of registering, and there must be some content. And as soon as the act of speaking occurs, there comes into being immediately an obligation and a claim, which are mutually dependent upon each other and which are mutually dependent with the promise. And the obligation is dependent upon the promisor because it's the promisor who has the obligation. The claim is dependent on the promisee for the obvious reason. And the promisor must have a sincere intention. And for the whole thing to work, there has to be a relation of trust between the promisor and the promisee. And then there are background felicity conditions, such as a common language, a capacity on the part of the promisor to perform the action which is promised, and so forth. The action doesn't exist necessarily, and it certainly doesn't exist yet. Rather, the action is properly to be understood in terms of dispositions. Because the promisor made the promise, he thereby acquires a disposition to do F. So this is what Reinach calls a tendency. And this is the tendency is now formulated in green. The promisor is the agent of the tendency. And now we can see how each of the different BFO Lego bricks is realized in this whole picture. So there, the yellow part is a disposition. The obligation and claim are dispositions. Promisor and promisee are a matter of roles which are had by the corresponding persons, and the whole is joined together by means of a process of promising. Now, remember, this gives only an account of the beginning to exist of the obligation and claim. It doesn't tell us how they survive. For that, we would need to talk about memories on the one hand, and associated reliability and other dispositions on the part, especially of the promisee. But we would also, where more complex promises such as contracts are at issue, need to talk about documents. And I'm going to come to an end now because I've come to my 45 minutes. But now let's just look at how this works with a command. Here, the commander is the person who speaks, and the commandee is the person who registered. There is once again a claim and an obligation, but now the poor commandee gets the obligation without having to do anything, where in the case of a promisor, it was the act of speaking which created his or her obligation. So here the commander gets to have a claim on somebody just by speaking, which is a nice position to be in. And he has or she. So if I fail to say or she, then I meant or she. So the commander can do this because of a relational authority which he has because of the promotions which he has been subject to because of the evaluations which have been performed on him because of the assignments which he successfully completed, and so on. So this relation of authority is hard-earned. And of course, this is not just a one-to-one affair. We have a whole echelon, commander and commandee. And there are, I've forgotten what the green things mean, but probably trust. Or a relation of authority, actually. Is that right? Let's go back. So the agent. So the commander, well, that doesn't really make much sense. But anyway, it all works when it's done properly. So that there is communication of specific, progressively more specific elements of the plan. So the plan specification is worked out in detail by the staff of the commander. The commander's job is to commit to a certain plan specification, and then to command his subordinates, to command their subordinates, to command their subordinates to realize the plan. And now we finish with music. So I'm not going to give you any music now. I'm going to put forward what I hope is the provocative claim that music is a document act. And I'm not now talking about jazz music. I'm talking about classical symphonic music. This is an orchestral score with staves. And the score manifests a kind of modularity. So I want you to think of the score as a plan specification, and then the staves for the specific instruments are subplans, which are like the subplans further down the cascade in the case of the military plan, which I showed you a few seconds ago. And then the actions of the players in an orchestral performance are intermeshed through the sets of intermeshed documents, which are the orchestral scores. So we have an intermeshing of actions, intermeshing of scores. And the conductor here provides the authority for the whole thing to happen. So he creates the orchestrated set of intermeshed actions on the part of the players in the orchestra. So all of the Reinackian account of command, which I described earlier, applies here. The commander is the conductor. The instrumentalists are obligated to the commander to follow his every movement of his baton, or of his arms or hands or eyes or even feet in certain circumstances, I imagine. So he coordinates, or she coordinates and steers through time the orchestral players, and there is modularity corresponding to the modularity of the military of an army. Basically, the instrumentalists play different weapons, and the orchestra is the commander. The conductor is the commander, and so the modularity of the score is reflected in the modularity of the orchestra, just as the modularity of the plan for the military operation is reflected in the modularity of the military units who execute the plan at the tactical level. And all of this is possible because there is musical doctrine. So all of the players have been drilled in musical doctrine so that they all know how to play their instruments, but also they all know how to play their instruments in time with other people who are playing their instruments and under the instructions of the orchestra. So, and it's the scores and sub-scores which allow training of the players so that they play actual pieces. So just as doctrine in the military allows training, which allows coordinated action, so musical doctrine allows training in the execution of the plans described in specific scores and sub-scores, which allow musical performance. And so they have to practice not just their instrument, they also have to practice how to follow the conductor, which is exactly parallel to the military case. They also need training to understand how to execute diagrams like this. And anyway, this is about scores and rehearsals. So you can't rehearse a piece of music unless there are scores. So even a blind pianist who doesn't need a score can only rehearse the score can only rehearse the piece if there is a score. He just can't read it. Now, of course, there are differences, and this is my final. So the military command and control is marked to a much greater degree than the musical command and control by a chain of command. So you may have a very deep chain of command in a military operation, where the orchestra has standardly 3 levels: the conductor, the first violinist, and the first oboist, and so forth, and the normal low-level violinist or oboist. Secondly, the military command and control has a much greater gulf between the training or the rehearsal and actual performance, because they have an enemy. Now, leaving aside certain exceptional occurrences when symphonies by Stravinsky are performed for the very first time and the orchestra, the audience reacts in a pugilistic manner, music doesn't have an enemy. And this means that musical performances can be composed. So doctrine here works without any interruption. Wars can be orchestrated, but they can never be composed because the enemy will always prevent the realization of the score according to the intentions of the author of the score. All right, that's the end.